So, Sel, does Lamar Jackson need to win a Super Bowl to remove the bias against black quarterbacks?
No, he does not need to win a Super Bowl to remove the bias that does not exist. Two, I guess the implications that were being suggested by LeBron James, Maverick, and the shop. Let's talk about this. Let's go here. How do I start this conversation? I start off by saying that bias will always be in existence. So if we're talking about a black bias against a quarterback, I just want to remind people every position, every player, anything you do, there will always be a level of bias. We were wired that way. We were wired to prejudge. You know why? It kept us safe. That's how we were able to evolve for all these years. Now, that said, I know what they're trying to say. What they're really trying to imply is, like, there's a prejudice that leads to a discrimination, that leads to a perception, that leads to a negative. I get you. But now I got to push back and say, oh, what said bias? The face of the NFL is black, and he plays quarterback. His name is Patrick Mahomes. People and their memories. People and their memories. LeBron James, they really cornered my man, Lamar Jackson, into this conversation. One that I don't think Lamar Jackson really had true intentions of having. You want to know why? Because when Adam Schefter tweeted out, Ravens Lamar Jackson said racial bias against black quarterbacks is, quote, still there in the NFL. You know what Lamar said? That was not my response to that specific question. Don't start that, Adam. You want to know why? Because Lamar like, hey, bruh, don't y'all try to put no plight on my production when it doesn't exist to what they were suggesting. Our memories possess two distinct forms and systems of awareness. Let me give you one. The first one is for public consumption. And in the public consumption memory, you say things and you open yourself up to gain some pleasure. This is gonna sound good. Cocktail party, you know, small talk. The other one is for our emotional experience, and that one we want to conceal because it hides some pain. What happened in this one is LeBron James, as sophisticated as he is, as savvy as he is, and Maverick were businessmen more so than two individuals having an honest conversation. They put Lamar into a position where all he had to do was be in the crowd and nod. And in that nodding, and then him saying, yeah, I need to win the championship, gave them everything they needed to set Lamar Jackson up in this light. No, he doesn't need to win a Super Bowl because we already seen black quarterbacks win a Super Bowl. So if there's still a perceived bias, that didn't get rid of it. No, you don't need to win a Super Bowl to remove bias against black quarterbacks because there is no more bias. My last point is this. If you look at how black players are now being perceived as this position, from yesterday to today to tomorrow, things have evolved. Things have changed. So there is no more bias that is of prejudice and discrimination. So therefore, he doesn't need to win to remove it.
Man, I like your take. I had to ask myself this question, Sel, but okay. There is bias against quarterbacks. There's absolutely bias against quarterbacks. The question is it racial or is it ratio? Okay. I got to go to the big board to break that down. You gonna do it? I got to go to the big board. So I got my joggers on. I got my suit joggers on. So your boy athletic today. I can jog.
I hope those socks are somewhere.
I can do some high knees. No, I ain't got no socks. I ain't got no socks.
That's my dog.
There's bias against quarterbacks in the National Football League. But the question we all have to ask ourselves, is it racial or is it ratio? What do I mean? If you only have 6 passing yards for every 1 rushing yard, 6 passing yards or less, you have never won a Super Bowl as a quarterback. So there is definitely bias. Let's take a look at those quarterbacks that fall under that 6-to-1 ratio. You see our guy Mike Vick, 3.7 passing yards for every 1 rushing yard. You see Tim Tebow. He's not black, but still under that threshold. Cam Newton, Robert Griffin, Lamar Jackson. You're under that threshold of 6 passing yards to 1 rushing yard. Is it racial or is it ratio? Okay, let's take a look at the next slide because you'll see some other names and stats that are interesting. Steve Young, many say, well, he was a rushing quarterback. No, he wasn't. Calm down. 7.8 passing yards to every 1 rushing yard. Russell Wilson, he's a running quarterback. No, calm down. touchdown, 7.9 passing yards for every 1 rushing yard. Is it racial or is it ratio? In the NFL, there is bias against quarterbacks, but the question is it racial or is it ratio? Because if you look at the last slide, the quarterbacks with 6 passing yards or less to every 1 rushing yard, they just don't go very far. And not for very long. Mike Vick, conference championship game, the furthest he ever went in his 4th year in the league. Tim Tebow, the divisional round in his 2nd year in the league, the furthest he ever went. Cam Newton, he did go all the way to a Super Bowl. Super Cam, he won an MVP, but the 5th year in the league was his climactic moment. Robert Griffin, wild card, his 1st year in the league. And then the great Lamar Jackson, the furthest he has gone is the divisional round. He's done it twice, his 2nd year and his 3rd year in the league. So the question I've had to ask myself, and you need to ask yourself, is it racial or is it ratio? There's definitely bias against quarterbacks. I don't know, Sel, that Lamar Jackson was talking about as much as the racial bias that he suffers from, as much as the ratio bias that Lamar Jackson suffers from.
Bring it on. Okay. I love the fact that you brought us another layer, another level to this as you posed the question. You asked the question. But our checks don't get cashed by asking these questions as much as we got to answer these questions.
Talk to me.
Let's answer something that was implied. Let's answer what the inference looks like. What do you think it is? Do you think that Lamar Jackson would even sit in that room as Maverick Carter teed him up historically, saying about the bias against black quarterbacks? Therefore, he still needs to win one right now. What's your answer?
My answer is that Lamar Jackson suffers from ratio bias, but racial bias does exist for quarterbacks. Let me break down my why, and I'm glad you asked me that question. When people don't take the time to get to know someone, then they default to what they know about people that look like that someone they never took the time to know.
Let's go.
What do I mean? One of the most famous analysts on all of television, when Dwayne Haskins was coming out, questioned Dwayne Haskins because they were like, Dwayne Haskins is too much of a runner. Anybody who studied college football knew Dwayne Haskins had a Big Ten record 50 passing touchdowns and 4 interceptions. Dwayne Haskins is as far from a runner as possible. Dwayne Haskins only rushed for about 100 or 200 or so yards in college his last year there. Dwayne Haskins ran lesser than a 5.0 40-yard dash time. So the only reason that one could construe or misconstrue that Dwayne Haskins, the Ohio State great, was a runner is because people that play that position that look like Dwayne Haskins are typically runners. So when you don't take the time to actually get to know someone on a personal level, then you default to what you know about people who look like that someone you never took the time to know. I do think there is still racial bias in the NFL, but what I think Lamar Jackson suffers from is ratio bias. Let me elaborate, Sel, and I'm done for this.
Yeah, I want to hear about this racial bias.
There clearly, throughout the course of history, is a bias amongst black people intellectual capacity compared to white people. Why do I say so? I personally suffered from it. I heard this. I don't know if you ever heard, Acho, you're black, but you ain't black. Acho, you black, but you don't talk like you're black. Okay, so then what does talking like I'm black sound like? What does being black sound like? Because I enunciate all my syllables? Because, like, what does being black sound like? And so I often heard that. So I know from personal experience. I also know from studies that there's clearly a bias coming from an intellectual capacity amongst black people. We also know this much. There's a bias amongst, well, it takes a lot of intelligence to play the quarterback position. I don't think that's bias, I think that's fact. We say that quarterbacks have to be the smartest players on the field. Check. We know that exists. Then we say that black people in society are not as intelligent as white people. Check. We know those two things exist. So if you are collectively adding up those two correlations, it takes a lot of intelligence to play quarterback, and black people are lesser intelligent than white people from a societal perspective, then there can be a correlation between bias existing from a racial perspective at the quarterback position. But I think even more so than the racial, I think there is ratio. Because I do look at guys like Patrick Mahomes. I look at guys like Deshaun Watson. I look at guys like Russell Wilson. I look at guys like Dak Prescott. I look at guys that are black but aren't running quarterbacks, and I don't see them suffering too much from those same biases.
That's real. Now we're getting to where I think we need to go, because Lamar Jackson wasn't allowed the NFL experience before the bias kicked in at the combine and it continuously asking them to switch positions. Now, I think right there, we're not necessarily having a ratio conversation, we're having a bias conversation. Why are you looking at a former Heisman Trophy winner who actually played even better the year after as a guy who needs to switch positions? And a lot of people would just put that in a vacuum and say that's just all racial. But it wasn't, because we also looked at some other decorated quarterbacks over time that had to switch as well. You know, you go back to Scott Frost, Eric Crouch, systems that you're like, I don't know if that's going to translate to the NFL. So purely you can't make this racial. Purely you couldn't make it ratio. It's funny, though, you never finish the sentence and no one does, and I'm going to finish the sentence for you. Because historically we look at the position of quarterback and we always say, well, it was perceived to need a lot of intelligence in terms of participation at the quarterback position, right? You got to be smart. What they didn't say is you ain't got to be that good of an athlete. You know, everyone has figured out that has ever played sport, the fastest thing on the court, on the field is what? The ball.
Yes, sir.
So if you're going to play football, let's just say, and you're growing up and you're like, damn, I'm not the most athletic dude, there were very few places for you to go, right? All I'm saying is, at that same time, it wasn't necessarily a damning conversation to black people in terms of intelligence, but actually it was kind of being propped up like, dog, y'all kind of athletic at what you want to do in terms of your skill set. It was looking robust. White players as well. But we had to fight a bias about our intelligence. They were fighting a bias against their athleticism. Don't you see how these things go hand in hand? Let's talk about it right now, because I took a little offense to this, because the suggestion that there is still bias present day, using in comparison yesterday, the history of the position, I think really undermines the progress and undermines the reality. Let's talk about it. I call them cops, you know, C-O-P-S. Let's talk about the cops. First of all, if we're talking about any opportunity, let's talk about the compensation. 4 of the 5 highest paid players in the NFL in history are black. Okay, so far we got that handled. Let's talk about the opportunity. Well, do you want me to continue to list all the first rounders? Do you want to continue to list all the starters? Do you want to continue to list all of the opportunities that are given for black quarterbacks as well as white quarterbacks? Now let's finish with the promotion and projection. What do you leave this situation in terms of your future going forward and those who look like you represent you coming after you? Damn. Malik Willis, C.J. Stroud, Bryce Young, Anthony Richardson, Caleb Williams, etc. They coming. And they've been here. So the point is, I don't know, and you got to help me, because where's LeBron and Maverick coming from? It felt like almost that celebrity analyst that comes on game day, and this analysis is going to be kiddie pool. Like, they're not going deep on anything. But to have that level of platform, and then to opine that, and then to really corner someone who lives that experience, and lastly, to put Lamar in a position, contract situation, what level of pushback could he give other than what the show narrative was doing? To me, I just didn't like the whole taste of that moment.
He was obviously put in a bad position, but, Sel, I think that we would be ignorant, and I'll take the sting off the word, but the literal definition of ignoring some facts. We would be ignorant to say that racial bias doesn't exist, at least amongst some. Again, I had to go back and look up the direct quote. To me, the greatest entertainer of sports television, Stephen A. Greatest entertainer on sports television. Now, people question his analytical bit. He's the greatest entertainer in my mind currently in sports television. He says that Dwayne Haskins is more of a runner than a passer. Now, I'm putting a name to it now. If I saw Stephen A., I'd tell him so it's all love. Says Dwayne Haskins is more of a runner than a passer. Even amongst our colleagues that are black, bias can exist. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
It's not just white people who say, Sel, you not really black. It's not just black people who say, Acho, you not really black. You not black. I even think amongst people that look like Lamar Jackson, that bias can exist. I believe it just so happened to be, it wasn't Gil Brandt, correct me, who was it? Bill Polian. It was Bill Polian who said Lamar Jackson should be a wide receiver, not a quarterback, can't play the quarterback position. Now, if Lamar Jackson was a 4'8" guy, would Bill Polian have said that? Doubtful. But because we know Lamar Jackson is a 4'4" guy, a 4'3" guy, is Bill Polian going to say that? Absolutely. Let me give it to you in story form, and I am done. But one of my favorite stories I've ever had to recant. Playing for the Philadelphia Eagles, I got a call from a reporter. The reporter will stay nameless as long as we are on the air.
Wait a minute. You're going to bring up Stephen A. and not this reporter? Why? Because they ain't got it like Stephen A.? They're going to get fired?
We're not as close.
I
got a call from a reporter, and they asked me, Emmanuel, is Chip Kelly racist?
Oh, yeah, I got that call, too.
So it took me back. Like, is Chip Kelly racist? First thing I'm wondering is, why are you asking me that? So then I had to take a step back and start to do some math. Oh, wait a second. Chip Kelly gave Riley Cooper a 5-year, $25 million deal within the same season that Riley Cooper was caught on camera saying the N-word. I will jump over this fence and fight all you N-words in here. So Chip Kelly gives Riley Cooper a 5-year, $25 million deal. In that same year, Chip Kelly traded LeSean McCoy at the end of the season for Kiko Alonso. So Chip Kelly trades maybe the greatest running back in Philadelphia Eagles history for a white-looking linebacker. Kiko Alonso, I believe, is Cuban.
What?
He's Cuban.
White-looking.
White. So he trades LeSean McCoy.
This is their ammunition to call him racist.
And then he cuts DeSean Jackson, maybe the greatest deep threat in NFL history statistically. DeSean Jackson, Randy Moss. So they asked me, is Chip Kelly racist? I was taken aback because I'm like, I've known the dude for 3 years. I didn't think he's racist, but where are you coming from? Oh, he pays the white dude 5 years, $25 million. He cuts the two black trades and cuts one of the two black players that are better. And I thought for a second, I said, no. Chip Kelly's not racist, but Chip Kelly, in my mind, gravitated towards the attributes and characteristics that within our locker room were more found in white players than black players. So I see why you would assume that he's racist, but it's a nuanced conversation. I said, here's why, Sel. Because we had a white player, Pro Bowler, several times over, who had the attributes and characteristics that Chip Kelly typically found in the black players within our locker room. But then we had black players who had attributes and characteristics that were typically found within the white players within our locker room.
Really?
And so I was like, no, Chip isn't racist. But if you're lazy and you only look at the surface and you say, okay, he pays the white receiver who's not as good as DeSean Jackson. Mind you, the white receiver said the N-word. He cuts DeSean Jackson, who is a beast, and DeSean was in his prime, and he trades LeSean McCoy. I understand. So it's nuanced, just like I think this racial ratio thing is nuanced. I think that there is a bias against quarterbacks that are greater runners than they are passers relative to how great are you running and passing. Typically, within the quarterbacks that are greater runners than they are passers, you see that in black quarterbacks. But I think it is just as much ratio as it is racial.
Yeah, but that ain't what LeBron thinking. That ain't what Mav thinking. And it sounds like, to some degree, Lamar Jackson certainly experienced something that wasn't about ratio. It was about ratio. I played with Matt Jones, who was a quarterback in college.
He was a beast, too.
And that big old dude got moved to receiver because it was like, yo, do you jog a 4.3 at 6'6"? Yeah, I think you should jump and catch the ball, okay? Your prospects are different at that position. And he was a first rounder. Here's the thing. I also know that in this situation, it's crazy. It just seems like the narrative just continues to live stronger than the reality supports that narrative. Like, even watching the clip, they literally had to give a history lesson on the position just to talk about present day. When you're sitting next to a guy, bias included, who's probably going to get offered $200 to $300 million to play the position, who's won one playoff game. Okay. The face of the league is black. The highest paid players, 4 to 5, are black. Opportunities left and right are black. It's almost like, let me say it right. If the proof is not disproving the bias, then what premise is the bias really standing on? It's interesting, man, because it's like, it's almost like you're selling a story that you want people to believe there's an excuse, there's a reason, or there's an opportunity to be lesser than who you are because they won't give you the same opportunities. Really distasteful to me. I hope I get on the shop, which I never will be. But if I were, I would push back like Lamar couldn't, even if my contract was up.